Getting to meet the new Denver Nuggets rookies. A look at the question of how good do the Denver Nuggets need to be next season on offense and defense. And more importantly, who's going to be better, the Lakers or the Nuggets? This is Locked On Nuggets.
You are Locked On Nuggets, your daily Denver Nuggets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Nuggets, your daily Denver Nuggets podcast, part of the Locked On Network, your team every day. Thanks for making us your first listen each and every day. We're free and we're available on all platforms. My name is Matt Moore. I'm the senior NBA writer for the Action Network, joined by my colleague and friend Adam Mares. You can find him on Twitter at Adam_Mares. Back with you. I did a podcast late last night around midnight, and now I'm back at it with Adam Mares, hitting all sorts of questions. If you want to hear about, I did kind of wrapped up my thoughts on the draft. I did a conversation with the chat, which was bumping last night, Adam. Chat's always bumping. We talked about free agency, fits, those types of things. But we're going to talk a little bit more today about a number of things. We will talk about how good the Nuggets need to be on offense and defense in terms of the league, where they need to be ranked to contend for a championship next season. And in the third segment, we will answer the age-old question of who's going to be better, the Lakers or the Nuggets, after Russell Westbrook opted into his $41 million option for next season, or plans to, according to reports. But first, it's time to get to know the new rookies. Adam?
Yes.
You were at the presser yesterday. I'd love to get your thoughts on the presser and what the rookies had to say, what you think, what your first impressions are of the Denver Nuggets' new additions to the roster.
Well, you and I had talked about this, yesterday before him, about how these aren't the most meaty or like meaningful pressers. There's a lot of what you're going to hear. You're going to hear sort of the cliches from these guys. And that was definitely true. But there were some interesting little details that were left in there. The first thing, Matt, I don't know if you've been down to Ball Arena. They held this presser in the Stanley Cup Finals press room, which is designed to house some 400 people. There was like 6 of us there. So it was actually, just to kind of give a behind the scenes, it was a pretty funny setup in that there's a giant room with this big old stand and then, like 4, 5, 6 of us there. So I thought there was actually more family members in attendance for this presser than there were media members, by about double. So that part of it was kind of funny. But I just thought it was good. It was good to hear from these guys. They all certainly know how to say the right things. Very defensive minded, focused on that. All of them seem to have a good understanding of where they are in the pecking order, coming in. There's not a lot of I expect to start, or crazy. Sometimes you just get a sense of the crazy expectation rookie where you're kind of like, whoa, you don't really quite get what this is about. I didn't sense that from any of the guys that spoke yesterday. So it was just a good first impression from these guys seem like, they understand that they're here to work, and they're not necessarily here to play. They're here to work and to try to earn minutes through that hard work.
CT3 asked, do you guys think Brown could carve out a role immediately as a 3-and-D wing? What are your thoughts on that?
I think he absolutely can. And even more, I know that the Nuggets view him that way. Nuggets front office view him that way as a guy. I don't think they view him as a guy that comes in and should be penciled in for a role, especially when you look at the roster as currently constructed, features a second unit of Monte Morris and Bones Highland. Beating out either of those guys, meaning he's going to play in those spots, is extremely unlikely. But I know that the front office views him as a guy that they hope by games 20-25 is getting that opportunity. Number one, Jamal Murray is likely to be load managed throughout the season, both from on a game per minute basis. But I think I would not be surprised if Jamal Murray does not play back-to-backs until, January, something like that. So you're already going to be taking one guy out of the backcourt rotation almost, as a scheduled rest nights. And then you have obviously any injury that pops up. But I think the front office hopes and maybe even kind of expects that by the trade deadline, Christian Braun is a guy that you feel comfortable being your backup to. And they'll make decisions at the trade deadline, I think, based on that.
Okay.
What do you think? I want to know what you think. That's what they think. And I certainly look at him as a guy that's 6'7", good defensive player who's coming here to play defense. They need that role. So I understand that bet of like, let's get to the trade deadline and feel like if we need a 1-year gap or if he's ready for us to count on him there.
I think I've never been more uncertain about a rookie's role in the league. And what I mean by that is that usually, like based off of the longstanding norms, it would be my answer would be no, because you're competing for a championship and rookies usually don't know enough to be able to be on the court in those meaningful situations for a championship team, even in like key big regular season games. We've seen kind of a shift away from that. We've seen younger guys get more and more minutes lately for various teams that are actually trying to compete now. And so if Brown comes in and provides that, I think I would say if Brown is turning into the go-to option for 3-and-D in terms of like, well, we need some defense out there, let's get Christian Brown out there, I'm going to be a little concerned. Not that he can't do it, just that you didn't upgrade the roster in such a way that there are better options, which obviously, like talked about last night, if that's the case, that's the case, right? And so that I think, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the second segment as well. But that's kind of my like initial push there, is that if like Brown might be a really standout rookie, if you need him, that's a bad sign, is kind of my initial impression. Is that fair? Does that make sense?
I think at best he would move his way into the fourth guard position. How much do you really need a fourth guard in the playoffs? You know, I mean, again, I think it depends. By the time you get to February's trade deadline, they'll be able to make that determination. Do we have other defensive options there? And maybe it's a thing, by the way, Matt, of can he beat out an Austin Rivers? I'm not saying they're bringing him back, but maybe they have an Austin Rivers caliber player that's sort of right there with him to start the year. And let's see if he can surpass him or not. And go from there. But we obviously both believe that the Nuggets are going to try to upgrade their starting shooting guard, and that upgrade will come as their primary, point of attack defender. So really, you're talking about a second best defender there. And again, I don't know what kind of percentage or odd to put on it, but maybe it's 50-50 that he gets there. I think he's that caliber of prospect. The question is, can he become that caliber of player in 4 months, basically regular season months? I think it's a decent enough bet. They need a player that, like, the player you're going to get as your backup shooting guard is probably not that great of a player. They're probably highly flawed. So I think they're looking at him and hoping he can get his defense up to snuff because he's less flawed as an offensive player.
What were your impressions of Peyton Watson?
He's super interesting to me. I really liked him. Liked how he talked and what he had to say. Some of his different perspectives. He understands that he's coming in to be a worker as well. He was asked about not playing minutes early on. And, you could just tell from his response that he understood that was part of, that's the ticket he's been handed. Like, so it wasn't sometimes you worry about those guys and they'll come in and everybody's been trained on what to say, but sometimes you can read between the lines of like, I'm coming here to surprise people. People don't know this or that. And you're like, hey man, like they picked you. You're not here to surprise anyone. They chose you. Like, right. You're here to like go through a process that is probably going to be a long and slow one. And I just sensed from hearing him talk that he understood that. And then he especially, I thought, stressed the idea of like, you want to know, why is a guy going to fit? Another thing you ask these young players, like, why do you think you're going to make it? And maybe they say like, they could say certain answers that you're thinking like, okay, you don't get it. Oh, it's my shot, or it's, man, people don't get the. I thought he came in and he's like, well, I'm going to, basically work hard and work harder than everyone. And I'm, going to do the dirty work and this or that. So I just felt like he at least represented that he understood what his ticket was, with one major caveat. I asked him what he thought his best like comp was offensively. And he said, I want to be Peyton Washington. I don't want to be someone else, but he did give Kevin Durant and Paul George. So I'm always interested when players comp themselves to some of the greatest scorers of all time when they have a long way to go to becoming a great scorer.
Yeah. Young people never comp themselves to well, it's funny, right? Because it's like, I was going to say like to the median or to manage expectations, but it's also like, man, if you just said that you wanted to come in and be
Mikal Bridges.
Yeah. Some of that caliber, you're still like one of the 60 best NBA players in the world, basketball players in the world. So it's crazy how that kind of goes. All right, let's take a break and we'll come back. And you asked me a very interesting question through text when we were figuring out our show this morning. And I was like, ooh, that's a really good idea. So we're going to ask, what is Denver's defense and offensive ranking next season if they run it back with the current players, and what does it need to be to win a championship? We'll do that when we come back on Locked On Nuggets. But first, I've got to tell you about Rock Auto. There's all these different models coming out all of the time, and they've all got different parts. And there's so many providers for those parts. There's so many different brands. You want to be able to get what you want. If you go to one of these big box stores, there's no guarantee. You don't know if they're going to have the part. You don't know if they're going to have it in stock. You don't know if they're going to carry that particular brand. You don't know if you're going to have to wait 2 weeks for it to get shipped in, or have to wait while they get it from another store, or drive across town. You don't need to mess with that. Just go to rockauto.com and you're going to get exactly what you need. You save time and money when using Rock Auto. A Honda Odyssey fuel pump is $353 from a chain store. It's just $216 from Rock Auto. They're a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Rock Auto prices are reliably low for every customer, and they've got everything you need from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, and even new carpet. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in their How'd You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need at rockauto.com. We'll be right back on Locked On Nuggets. Back here on Locked On Nuggets. Thanks for joining us and making us part of your day. Really appreciate you guys joining us on a Tuesday. Chat tells us that Davon Reed and Vlatko Cancar got their restricted free agency tenders today. They got their options for the QOs. So nothing surprising there. I think Davon Reed's back. I don't know about Vlatko. Would you expect Vlatko to be back next season?
I'd heard maybe a month ago that they do expect him to sign him, like that he'll probably somebody told me he'll probably be here as long as Jokic is here. Take that for what it's worth. So yes, the past Nuggets have had 2 or 3 roster spots that felt like dead roster spots, maybe even more than that, the bowl types. You look at it right now, Peyton Watson is going to be one of those dead spots. Vlatko Cancar would be a second one of those spots. Do you have room for another one? Like if you're in win now mode. By the way, I wouldn't even be surprised if Denver held an open roster spot, a very common thing to do because it allows you to add players throughout the season if you feel like, okay, the team is deficient here. So maybe 2 or 3 spots that are kind of just dead spots on top of Davon Reed, who, if they bring him back, not guaranteed to be like the go-to guy. So I'm not surprised, but I do think Denver is reaching. We're already, before we get to free agency, reaching the limit of players that are not likely to play that will be on the roster.
So let's go into and we're getting a lot of spots kind of getting locked up by guys that are around, which leads us to our next question. I want to start here. Joe asked, I don't understand why running it back is such a failure in your eyes. They played Golden State as tough as anyone, and they were missing the core of the lineup. So we have kind of talked about it, and I said last night that I will be very critical if they run it back. A lot of that is based off of the expectation. I think it's difficult for you to sell. We're going to be super aggressive, and we're going to, we got to change things up. The opportunity is now, all that momentum coming out of the playoff series versus Golden State, and they'd be like, well, we couldn't actually do that, so we just decided to run it back. So here's the team again. I think you lose momentum. I think it fails to understand some of the roster problems of the team last season, even if they were exacerbated by the guys that were missing. But let's answer the question that you asked me, which is, what do the Nuggets rank on offense and defense if they run it back? If they just bring everybody back, where are they going to rank next season?
Well,
and there will probably...
Yeah. Well, I just want to answer the first part of that question. Will Barton was one of the marks in the playoffs last year. That was one of the guys that Golden State looked at and said, we can go at him. And I think Calvin's philosophy, and I think it's the right one, is you look at it and say, Denver already has Michael Porter is always going to be a mark. Maybe he makes his one-on-one defense, improves it. But I still think he's going to be a guy that you look at and say he has some vulnerabilities defensively. Bones Highland is a mark and will be for probably another season or 2. We'll see. Maybe he surprises me, but I think he'll be a mark. You've already got 2. I don't think you can have a third one, especially if they're a Will Barton caliber player. What I mean is he's a good offensive player. He's not elite. So to me, he's the piece to me that you look at and say, running it back with him, I do think there is a cap on your defense, which brings us to this topic of where are you now? Where will you be if you run it back with a healthy Murray and Jamal? And how high do you have to get, especially on the defensive end? How high do you have to climb in that ranking? Did you freeze, Matt? Matt Freeze again? Oh my goodness. All right, I'll just start us off then here, and hopefully he'll join us momentarily. Last year, the Nuggets ranked 6th on offense, which is wild, not having Jamal Murray or Michael Porter. And they ranked 15th on defense with a 111.5 defensive rating. So you already start from the offense, I think, is almost a lock to get better. It's not an absolute lock, but it's almost a lock to get better with a healthy Jamal. Also, by the way, I think an underrated aspect of the Denver's offensive rating is for half of the season, the offensive rating for that second unit was so abysmal. If you just look at the offensive rating with the starting unit and then like put in a league average second unit, Denver probably is top 3, top 2 in offense this last season without Jamal, without Michael Porter. So now that you add Bones Highland into a second year, if you put Monte Morris back to that bench, who's also a great positive offensive player, then I think you look at it, and I think Denver has to be top, I want to say top 3 on offense, in part because we just don't know, like Brooklyn Nets might have another number 1 offense by virtue of like Kyrie and KD being back. Nonetheless, Denver, I think, can be enough of an outlier on offense to be in that, Brooklyn range where it's like, okay, they're as good as anyone. They're going to be there. The question is defensively, they were 15th. You add Jamal Murray, who I think is a much better defender than Monte Morris. I don't know if he will be throughout the whole season. You add Michael Porter, who I think is a worse defensive player than Jeff Green, although it should be noted his defensive numbers, he makes this impact for Denver when they're fully healthy, where I think he'll get exploited in a playoff. So I'm not saying he's a great defender. His weaknesses will be exploited. But in the regular season, his rebounding and rim protection somehow adds quite a bit to Denver's defense. So I actually don't think he is going to be a regular season negative to their overall rating. And then more importantly, swapping out Will Barton for a more defensive-minded 2 to me elevates him. So to me, I think if you just run it back with Will Barton, I would say they're going to be number 1 or 2 offense, and they're probably going to be 10, 11, 12 defense, somewhere in the top half, but closer to half than to the top.
Okay, I'm back. Restream's giving me problems lately. So
I just said top 2 offense.
Yeah, I was listening. So I think here's a good kind of like baseline. In 2020 at dunksandthrees.com on adjusted offensive rating, they were 4th in offense. And so I think that's like a reasonable bar. Even if it's, I think here's the big thing is it's also not about the ranking, but the gap, right? So I don't expect it to be 1 big gap, 2 and 3 big gap Nuggets.
They're going to be in the top gap, whatever that top
tier of offenses. That's where I expect Denver to be. They may not be the top 1. They may be ahead or behind by 2 points per possession, but I think they wind up in that range.
But here you missed this. The part you did miss though, is I said that part of their offensive rating, even in that year, is their starters are the top. Like they're in the top 3 or 4 5-man units.
Yeah.
It's that second unit. And last year in particular, they were a top 6 offense. Their second unit for half the year was the worst offense that's ever played basketball. So I think if you have Monte Morris, Bones Highland as your backcourt, that's a really good offensive start to your second unit. We'll see how the other pieces fill in. But so that's the part where, to me, I'm looking at them and thinking, I think that they need to be a top 2 one because, yes, they need to be in that top tier. But I think their calling card is, I don't think they're going to get to the defensive level. I think that even if you ran it back, they would be, if not 1, 2 on the offensive end.
It's interesting that you actually, I think, are more optimistic on their defense than I am. I think at this point, given how they've trended, I'm a little bit more skeptical of them being able to be a top 12 defense. I think 14 to 18 is probably the range.
They're running it back, man. This is with Will Barton and Davon Reed. And okay.
Right. If they add a legit 2-guard defender, then I think they can probably be 10, maybe 8. Right.
So right now you said 15. Is that what you said? 15? I said run it back option?
14 to 18.
14 to 18. Middle. Yep.
Yeah. Like I don't expect them to be a bottom 10 defense just because what's weird about them though is they wax and wane, right? Where they have these months where it's like, hey, they're top 3 in defense this month. And then they have months where it's like they are literally like Malone will be like, yeah, over the last month we're 30th in defensive rating. And you're just like, why? Right. Like what? How are your good moments this good? And a lot of it's variance, but I don't necessarily see a lot of other teams that that's one of the things I've noticed. Is like I don't see other teams that have months where they're top 5 and months where they're bottom 5.
Right.
It's very strange. Like their baseline, either the defensive floor is higher or the defensive ceiling is lower for teams. Where it's like, yeah, they had a good month, they were 18th. Oh, they had a bad month, they were.
I think they would see. I think they would be similar to this year in that because I'm with you. We have them in the same range actually. I think I said 12, 12 to 18. So I had the high side a little bit higher, but at the end of the day, it's all the same. What I think is it wouldn't translate to the postseason, which is the most important thing. Like they could be this team that surprises everyone with a number 9 defensive rating somehow, and you get to the playoffs and it's like, nope, they're still tragically flawed defensively, and it doesn't matter what their ranking is. They're going to be the worst team in the playoffs. So defensively, so the ranking almost doesn't matter. It's just that they would be fine but flawed.
Yeah, this is actually a pretty good point here. The coupon user 16. They held teams minus 1.5% below. Basically, they held teams below on true shooting. They were plus 1% in turnover frequency and minus 2.4% the average.
Those are all Jokic traits.
Below OREB. Yeah, because he played a ton of minutes. And
but I'm saying also he takes away a lot of your dunks and layups and forces them to be floaters, which is where that number comes up. But again, in the playoffs, teams know how to stack it so that he's in the more vulnerable spots and you have to be able to cover for him.
So if you look at it from that perspective and you go like, well, then what was the problem? And the answer is turnovers, right? And Jamal Murray being back and the offense being crisper and having more weapons so that teams can't scheme Jokic the same way probably helps with turnovers considerably. This is always going to be a turnover prone team, and that is okay. Like Golden State was a turnover prone team and they have won several titles. It is not a you can't turn the ball over like this and win. It is simply a matter of how bad it can get. And when it got bad with Denver, it was horrible. Because on the other hand of this is Boston that basically was giving up so many points off of turnovers, even though they play good defense, it wasn't enough for them because they gave up 20 points per game on defense. We're talking about the regular season. I do think the question here is are they going to have the answers defensively? That to me, I think is my biggest concern if they run it back. Is I just don't know. They can make it through the regular season fine, but they're not going to have the answers defensively that they're going to need in the playoffs. You got to have something you can throw out there and be like, hey, this guy works. These two guys work. This lineup works. If we got to go to this, we can go to this. And especially, I think, with MPJ, given his history of defensive issues, given his injury history, I think you have to have, options there. And maybe, they're counting on Davon Reed to be a lot of these. And look, he would have helped. He would have helped versus the Warriors. Like not converting his 2-way contract was a mistake. It was. We said it at the time, and it was a mistake. But yeah, I think defensively, that's my big concern of running it back. I don't know if you can be the level that you need to be. For me to consider them like a championship contender at mid-season, I don't know if I can do that if they run it back without having a defensive option.
I'm 1,000% with you, but here's the one interesting thing that I think will make everyone uncomfortable. By the way, you kind of almost right before your thing broke out the first time, you almost glossed over the fact that the biggest part of running it back is that the Nuggets told everyone they were going to be aggressive this offseason. So if you ran it back, it'd be like, what do you mean? What did you mean by we're going to be aggressive? But if the Nuggets did enter the season next year with, Will Barton as your starting shooting guard, I do think Denver would survive the regular season. Like Will Barton is not a regular season problem. He's a postseason problem for the most part, especially when you had your fully healthy lineup. So Denver could do that if they get to free agency and they strike out and they feel bad about it. I think everybody would be supremely uncomfortable because it's one of those things where you've got 2 strikes. You've only got 1 more pitch to swing at before you're out of there. So, but now the question is, let's say if you swap Will Barton, let's just say Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. I don't think that trade is going to happen. But if you were to swap him, so you have Kentavious Caldwell-Pope to me as like a good defensive shooting guard. I don't think he's elite. He's not a lockdown. He's not like one of the top guys, but he's very solid. If you just swap those pieces, and let's say you swap Jeff Green for a defensive backup center. So you have a backup center in place who can rim roll and, just a guy, so to speak, but, a good rim protecting guy to play 15 minutes. And you have a good starting shooting guard. Now, where do you think Denver is?
median outcome, top 2 offense, top 9 defense.
Isn't that a championship formula? It's
Yes.
not a slam dunk one, but I feel
Yeah.
like if you're a solid top 9, and oh, by the
Yeah.
way, you have this like defensive shooting guard who's starting, you've got Christian Brown, there as an option, hopefully by the end of the year. And maybe you have an Austin Rivers or some 2-3 combo a la Davon Reed that maybe in a pinch you have to play him in a playoff series. If you have that, again, it's not a slam dunk, but at least you have the like, hey, this might work in a playoffs. We have length. You've got defense. We know we're going to be pretty unguardable on offense. To me, that's kind of like the best scenario. Or maybe a Bruce Brown is actually, I know a name that we've thrown out, but Bruce Brown to me is like, okay, maybe top 7 defense, 8 defense, and consistent in the playoffs.
Jamal, Austin, KCP, Aaron Gordon, Jokic. That's a playoff viable lineup. That's a lineup you can.
Did you just take MPJ out of the lineup?
No, I'm putting Austin in. Putting Austin in.
That's so wild.
I mean,
it might be true too. It might be true too. Like you might.
No, I'm not saying. I'm sorry. I'm not saying as a starting unit. I am entirely thinking about like.
I got you.
Like if you're playing the Warriors and you're like, we need a counter that can counter a 3-guard lineup.
Right.
Like we need a 3-guard counter lineup.
It might become your most essential lineup.
Yeah. Right. Like think about it this way: if you're playing the Warriors again and they run out the death lineup, which honestly wasn't all that death-y, the Nuggets helped kind of solve that, and other teams were able to manage it. The numbers were not insane for those lineups, but if they run out that death ball lineup with the 3 guards with Steph, Clay, and Jordan Poole, you have Jamal guard Jordan Poole, you have KCP guard Klay Thompson, and you have Austin guard Steph.
Right.
And that's like, yes, Steph's going to do his thing because he's Steph Curry, but that's viable. Like you're no longer like, boy, this thing is just bleeding. This thing is bleeding points. As long as that's not the case, you can win a championship. Let's take a break. We'll come back and we'll answer a question that Adam was like, oh, that's a great question. I'm already annoyed at it, which I was like, this is my lot. This is what I do. This is what I was put on the plan to do. Are the Lakers going to be better than the Nuggets next season? We'll answer that when we come back on Locked On Nuggets. But first, I got to tell you about BetOnline. BetOnline.net's your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. You get all the latest developments, league reviews, and news. You can bet on Major League Baseball. WNBA is great to bet on. Going to be betting on some WNBA today. You get in on your NFL futures. You can bet on the Avs to repeat as Stanley Cup champions. I'm going to the parade on Thursday, Adam.
Me too.
Very excited.
Me too.
BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news. You can get in on MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. We'll be right back on Locked On Nuggets. Back here on Locked On Nuggets. Thanks for making us your first listen each and every day. Glad to have you with us. And let's start off the segment with a great question or a statement from the chat. Igor says, with all due respect, what an incredibly dumb question. That's what I'm here for, Igor. Incredibly dumb questions. Russell Westbrook.
I wonder why it's a dumb question. I actually think it's an interesting one, personally.
Russell Westbrook opted into his $41 million option for next season. The Los Angeles Lakers are extremely limited in what they have available to do. I am going to say that I am not ruling out anything. This is the Lakers, and everybody wants to be a Laker.
That's why it's an interesting question. Like, the point, oh, look at how bad they are, this, that. Have you guys not watched the league for the last 50 years?
Yeah. Yeah. And, Charles says the Lakers are old and injury prone and brittle. They're going to reshape that roster. Like, they're not going to have Trevor Ariza around.
They may or may not. We'll find out. But the odds of them doing it are larger than what logically appears to be the case.
Yeah. And so I will say this, like, look, I've done the numbers on this. When LeBron and Anthony Davis play together, they're a 50 to 60 win team. That's the pace that they play at when those two guys are on the court together. And you can absolutely be like, yeah, but Anthony Davis is never going to be healthy. The Nuggets have 2 guys coming off of major injuries, including one guy who's missed 4 years out of the last 5, or 4 years out of the last 6, rather.
There is a funny calculus that goes on where people will project the Nuggets to be fully healthy and the Lakers not.
The Lakers are going to be fine, or the Nuggets are going to be fine, but the Lakers, and like everybody does this, and that's okay. That's part of being a fan. Seymour Pape says the Lakers are not making the playoffs next season. They're not a threat. Look, man, that's too far. I'm just telling you. Again, when LeBron and AD play, those two guys, their floor is so high.
LeBron forced the Lakers to miss the play-in. Like, he didn't want the play-in this year. They're artificially deflated. They were really like the 8th best team in the West this year if they wanted to be, even with the way the injuries went. And by the way, they made the worst roster possible. And I'm not even just meaning the Westbrook thing, which is the big thing, but it's all the other moves on the margins. They like did the worst job possible. Maybe they do it again. I'm rooting for it. I'm not ruling it out. But I don't know, like, even if they just have the second worst, off season possible, it's still a slight upgrade around two guys that are still elite.
I feel like it's possible all the guys in the Nets wind up
It's
there,
true.
and I don't mean Kyrie. I mean like
Yep.
Aldridge, because like LeBron's gonna want guys that he trusts, and he's only gonna trust guys that were good in his prime. No, I mean this is a pretty common thing. It's like
it's so true.
Everyone's frozen in time. It's why they had Melo. Melo was good to start the season, and everybody was like, "This man did not have a contract." They tried to keep him out of the league, and by the end of the year, crickets.
Right. The funniest one was Avery Bradley. Like, there was the I know that this year it was Mark Spears who did the victory lap like in week 1, saying like the Warriors just let Avery Bradley go. Like, what a crazy move.
Yeah.
And it's like they let him go for Gary Payton, who closed the finals. Like, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, and look, the Golden State Warrior veterans were upset.
They were
really upset about it, And I
will
say
where Marcus Spears' perspective was coming from. Like he's probably talking to these guys and he's thinking, I can't believe the hubris of the Golden State front office, which again took a lot of time to pay off.
And I mean, it's interesting also in retrospect, because Draymond's like talked about this, about like, I should have trusted Bob Myers. Like, I should have trusted Bob Myers and the guys at the top. Like, they've done such a good job. Like, I should have trusted them more, which is like refreshing, because players so rarely are like, yeah, I was wrong. Like, no, everyone in life is so rarely like, I was wrong. I'm
not underestimating this. The Westbrook problem is really, you guys are underestimating the Westbrook problem. Nope, not really. Not like, as long as he is on the roster, I do think that they have a ceiling that is lower than whatever Denver's is. But the problems sometimes get solved in ways you don't suspect.
I also don't know if he's going to be on the roster.
That's what I'm saying. Like that's my point, is I'm saying like, it doesn't logically, you can look at it and say who's going to take on that contract, but these things happen.
Like, Charlotte's already indicated an interest in him. Charlotte's trying to move Gordon Hayward. That gets you most of the way there on the money. Like, the money is the bigger problem. Like, lots of teams are going to be like, look, Russ is flawed, but he still brings a lot to the table. And if he has a good year with us, that could really help us.
Right.
It's the money that's the problem. You have to generate enough salary to send back in a deal. And so there's very limited options, but the ones that are out there, and look, I'm just going to tell you, I'm not sold. Everyone's like, well, the Nets are running it back. I do not understand this. Kyrie Irving does not get to decide if he's traded or not. He does not have a no trade clause.
Right.
It's not what he does.
Right. Same with KD. Not that they're looking to trade him, but
yeah, like the Nets get to decide what they do here. The Nets basically get to decide, like, Kevin Durant is worth whatever the pain is, and we will put up with another year from this space cadet to try and keep Kevin Durant. Or they could be like, no, look, we have to be like a real basketball team. This is not going to work. No, move him. And if they move him, the most likely destination is the Lakers. So,
what's your final ruling here? Like, I mean, what this headline really is predicting is, are the Lakers going to get out of the mess they made for themselves? Are they going to wiggle out of it? Because we both think Denver's going to be very good. And right now the Lakers are not that. So do you think they're going to wiggle out of this somehow?
God, this is tough.
And what percentage would you put it on? Yes or no, I guess. Maybe that's an easier question.
Are the Lakers going to be better? So that's the question I'm trying to answer here. Are the Lakers going to be better than the Nuggets percentage chance? There is a 40 to 45% chance they are better than the Nuggets.
I think it's lower than that, because I think the Lakers could probably get out of the Westbrook thing in a way we don't totally see at the moment. But that they're still not better than the Nuggets. Like they could still get out of there, and Denver's still going to be a very, very good team next year. But I still think the chance of them wiggling out of this are like 50-50. So when you factor in the 50-50 aspect of whether they'll get out of the Westbrook deal, and then you factor in even if they do, it's not 100%, I'll go a little bit lower and say 30%, 20, maybe 25%. So I still think Denver's going to be a lot better, but I'm just telling people I've watched this play out enough times to know that if it were Denver and they had made all these moves to ruin their supporting cast around their top two guys, it probably would take a decade to wiggle out of. The Lakers, these things just tend to happen.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of like coercion that can go into place to like force, oh, our hands are tied. What are we supposed to do with Kyrie? He's not playing and he's not doing that. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, you get somehow make a deal that makes sense there. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with it. But I still think Denver will be better. I think the odds are that Denver will be significantly better.
Okay. I think that there's a level of variance here that I always work into the regular season for various reasons. That's part of the equation, right? If you're like, both teams are fully healthy the entire year, well, one, that's never going to happen. But let's say it did.
Yeah.
Then we're probably 70-30.
Right.
And there's a 10% margin for error based off of like random chance. But I will say this, like, again, don't get caught in recency bias, which is what's happening. Like, well, I watched the Lakers last year. Okay. You watched the Lakers last year when LeBron was out for a significant portion and AD was out basically the entire year. Yeah. If LeBron and AD don't play,
and LeBron also spent the last like 15 games of the season just trying to rack up points, like not even trying to win, just like, hey, I'm going to get some points before I bow out of the season. Like they definitely are artificially depressed a little bit. The other part of this is, and it's funny you bring up health, Jamal Murray, I expect to play 60 games next year. Anything more than that would be surprising. Michael Porter, I mean, come on. Like, what are we really realistically counting on from him? 50 games? 60 would be like, to me, almost a miracle. Yeah. But 50, 60 games for both of those guys. So you're already talking about a lot of games not. And by the way, maybe tomorrow we'll talk about this. Some of the guys that I have listed as like interesting pieces for a potential, like to fill that shooting guard role are players like a Victor Oladipo who carry their own risk for injury risk. So like, it might be that Denver just has a lot of compromise. They have a lot of players, but they have some guys that are like their best options that maybe they don't play more than 40, 50, 60 games next year.
Yeah. And like, look, this is a lot of it is like, I just think this is highly variant based off of injuries, because to me, the gap, I'm telling you that the gap between the Nuggets and the Lakers is still such that they are still favored, even with that injury variance, to finish above them. I will also tell you that like the Clippers are not guaranteed to finish above the Nuggets based off of injury variance. Neither are the Warriors. Neither are the Suns. Like everyone's variance based off of those injury factors puts the Nuggets within range, depending on, do you get a good year or do you get a bad year? And there's really no way to invest in it. All right, let's go wrap it up for Locked On Nuggets. Great chat today. Great conversation. Really enjoyed it. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode.